I'm your host, Aileen Peterson, a traditional midwife, healer, herbalist, and Ancestral Earthskills guide providing holistic, full-spectrum, community-based support from cradle to grave. I'm also a disabled queer mother, permaculture farmsteader, writer, and artisan crafter currently residing on Catawba and Lumbee lands of southeast North Carolina. My ancestral lineages arise from across Europe, Swana, and the Lenape people of New Jersey and Turtle Island. This podcast is about remembering ancestral wisdom for healing and whole body well-being, reconnecting to earth-based lifeways through traditional skills and land connection, and reclaiming our sovereignty by rewilding our health, birth, and parenting. My work and these transmissions are spiritual, radical, and anarchist explorations of the depths of our primal nature and how to reconnect with our ancient lineages and birthright of wholeness, health, autonomy, and a magical wild life rooted in connection to land, spirit, and community. It is for those yearning for an older, deeper, wilder way to navigate the late-stage capitalist landscape of the Anthropocene age while supporting ourselves and our communities regeneratively within and beyond the systems we live in. We are decolonizing, revillaging, rematriating, remembering, and reclaiming together. Topics will range from home herbalism to plant spirit medicine, ancestor work and folk magic, traditional foods, ancestral lifeways, holistic wellness and healing work, land connection, permaculture and guerrilla homesteading, storytelling and myth mending, sacred birth, sex and death work, and reclaiming autonomy in our reproductive choices. This is for the folk remembering their wildness. Be sure to subscribe to our Substack and to the podcast on Apple Podcasts to get notified when new episodes are released and access to episode transcripts and additional resources. You can subscribe for free, but by joining our paid Substack tier for $5 a month, your financial contribution acts like a Patreon and helps us to create this content for you. You'll also get access to exclusive content not available anywhere else online, all archived Substack posts, and occasional freebies. A little note about language before we dive into today's episode. I am a queer woman who identifies with and uses both feminine and gender-neutral or non-binary language for myself, and I work with others who have various gender identities. The language that I use in this podcast is fluid, and I will go back and forth between utilizing gendered and non-gendered language, depending on the topic, source, and experience or experiencer. Please feel free to replace any gender-identifying terms with those that align more with yourself if needed when reading or listening to my publications. Today's episode is the first episode of the podcast called Midwyfing Myself and is an exploration of my journey of motherhood and how it has shaped my midwifery path. There is a content warning for this episode as there is mention of infant loss, clinical abortion, miscarriage, postpartum depression, birth trauma, and circumcision. You can read the full transcript at barewomanwisdom.substack.com. This is a rewriting or retelling of an edition of this story that was originally published in 2016, I believe, in the Squat Birth Journal in their last volume before they went out of print. So I hope you enjoy. I was given the opportunity to be a mother 8 times. 8 times the Creator struck stone to flint, and a spark of creation was offered to the tender bundle of my womb. But only 3 of those instances did I willingly grasp hold of that tender bundle, hold it aloft to the sky, and breathe breath into it, roaring that tiny ember to life. But 8 times I gave birth. 8 times my womb opened, and the bloody waters of my womb ocean trickled down my thighs. The first time, my body was young, too young, but I was eager and willing to be a mother. My child's father willing to be a father. I grew my first son in my young, slender body, but my body protested. I suppose it could not carry on this demand to form a whole new human being under the duress of losing the care and loving attention of my parents simply for this transgression. Having been denied the home birth I dearly wanted even at 16, my son was born 2 months too soon into a world of bright lights and plastic incubators, isolation, and a lack of touch. He did not live to see 3 weeks. taken from me because his doctors would not listen to the intuition of a teen mother. I was torn from not only my son, but his father as well, and hormonal birth control pills were shoved into my cold palms just as my breasts began to ache with milk. I no longer needed to pump, and I was left to my own grief, set adrift into a stormy sea. The night was dark, and the months following were long and lonely until I stopped the birth control and took care of my body back into my own hands. The second time, I was still too young, having been free in my inexperienced love after my first true heartbreak. But as independent as I was, I still had to wait those weeks until I turned 18 and could get an abortion without parental permission. Not wanting to miscarry at my parents' home, I chose surgery. And it was one of the most traumatizing experiences of my life. Not the pregnancy ending, not the loss of another babe before life could truly take root within my young body. I had already parted ways peacefully with that little spirit. No, it was the old white man who did not acknowledge me or my pain or my cries as he forced open my body. The old white man who talked over my tears to the nurse holding my hand about golf as he emptied my womb. The way he stood without looking at me, took off his gloves and left without a word, as the nurse, clearly traumatized herself, quietly and gently, albeit awkwardly, coaxed me from the operating table, out of my gown and into my clothes, and settled into a darkened recovery room for observation. It was the feeling of just being torn open and violated and looking around to see the same dark, distant expressions and tear-stained faces of the other silent women in the room with me as we were given a can of soda and had our vitals checked. It was realizing how many people go through that same experience every day and how it could be, should be, different. It was the isolation afterwards, my ex-partner tending to me as best he could overnight with delivery pizza, ibuprofen, and a heating pad, but mostly leaving me in my disassociation alone. That was when I swore to bring something different, something sacred and healing to this experience for others. The third time, a little over a year later, once I was living on my own, back with my first baby's father, and working full-time in a gentleman's club while going to massage school, just as I felt the familiar stirrings of life within me, and my moon was a few days past, it left my body not of my own choosing, but that of the spirit within me, that fire coal. A breath of air was not granted it, for whatever unknown reason, and it burned out before it touched the dry grass that would nourish it into a steady flame. No one believed me even as I felt the familiar pain crack open my sacrum, as the storm overcame me and I held blood in my hands, and I was yet again left alone in my grief. That was when I learned that you don't need the invasiveness of a D&C for a miscarriage successfully released at home, a lie I had been told my whole life. And again, I knew that this could be different. If we could have home births, why not home abortions and home miscarriages held and supported in the same ways we would a term birth? If birth was sacred, if our bodies underwent the same neurochemical processes and the same energetic states either way, why was this kind of birth any different? Life and death, two faces of the same coin. Then my second son nestled into my womb. I opened to receive him, my boy of the sacred trees. Still young and unknowing, but desiring something different like with my first, something wild and nurtured, a home birth, which was ultimately denied to me yet again. His pregnancy was uncomplicated, but fraught with the constant pestering and interventions of the medical system simply for having a history of preterm birth. He was born at term, swiftly and with the tearing open of my own body at the behest of a screaming midwife under the bright lights of a hospital delivery room. He was strong and roaring, but my body and my mind were broken. He did not take to my breast, and before he had nursed for the first time, before he was even 24 hours old, they took him away to put him under the knife. They would not let us wait, they would not let us come. They brought him back to me, crying and bleeding. I sobbed as he screamed for that first diaper change. His father stood with silent tears in his eyes, his jaw muscle clenching and unclenching over and over. What pain, what suffering we all endured in that place that smelled of sickness and death. I did not know until later how much the specter of depression had settled over me, claiming me, ripping away everything it could from me during the first half year after his birth. Our bodies harmed, our bond damaged and needing gentle care to repair. but I fought through long tear-filled nights and nourished him at my breast for 3 winters when his brother before him never had the chance. Yet again, I had been left alone in my grief, unseen and untended. This too I knew was wrong and should be different, needed to be different, and I swore then that I would be different, that I could give to others what I did not have, support others in the ways I wish I had been supported. Between my second son and my daughter's pregnancy, I had 2 other conceptions. Around this time, between 2013 and 2014, was when I coined the term pregnancy release and began to serve others in my community with holistic, sacred, self-managed home pregnancy release support. I knew there was a different, better way than what I had experienced at 18, and I had found it. In those 3 years between my children's births, I was aware of my body in ways I had not been as a younger woman, and was working with herbal contraceptives and the fertility awareness method. The first pregnancy, I was not yet working with Queen Anne's lace and conceived without penetration, just days before my 21st birthday when I knew I was fertile. That was my first autonomous, self-managed pregnancy release at home, around 5 weeks gestation, and it was one of the most empowering things I had done in my life. Only once did my Queen Anne's lace fail me, once I was working with her, and that was because I did not respect her rules. I was traveling, waited too long, was not regular with my doses. That pregnancy was also released at home with the aid of my herbal allies and medication, with herbs started at 7 weeks and the release completed with medication around 9 weeks. I midwifed myself through both experiences with the remote support of a beloved friend and colleague in the same work, in my own power and in my own home. I cared for myself tenderly in the postpartum with herbs and ceremony. Those experiences and the images from that second release went on to be the basis for my Rituals and Meditations for Pregnancy Release ebook that I published in 2015, and to educate other midwives and home pregnancy release providers in the years following. After that second pregnancy release, I sat with spirit in ritual and communion. I asked my guides and ancestors to watch over my daughter until it was time. I put a gaze on myself, setting the terms for her ability to return to earth through my body. As soon as those stipulations were seemingly met, I suppose spirits have a bit of a sense of humor, life flickered within my womb once more. I knew that this was my daughter, and it was time. I also knew that this pregnancy, this birth, would be like none of the others before. By this pregnancy, I had attended midwifery school, and I knew I would never step foot in a hospital again. I was determined this time to have a home birth, but then I learned of another option, even more radical, meaning returning to the roots, and it settled into my bones like a hymn. I had an unassisted wild pregnancy, receiving no gynecological or standard midwifery care, no labs, and no ultrasounds. I did my own prenatal, quote, care, and pregnancy was the healthiest I have ever been in my entire life before or since. I had access to organic whole foods, raw milk, herbs, and I was not working after 4 months gestation or before 7 months postpartum. I was tending a small suburban homestead at the time, and I had a midwifery colleague friend who I could reach out to with questions or concerns or to float ideas off of them if I felt the need to, and that was all. My partner trusted me, my body, and our ability to birth our baby. And I had done the deep soul-searching and spirit work required to make peace with death and to accept total autonomy and responsibility for what could unfold. I went on to have a beautiful, gentle 6.5-hour labor outside in a warm Southern Oregon autumn morning. I drummed her down, and my daughter came earthside into my own hands the day after the autumn equinox, born onto a deerskin. I had a small bleed, which I had prepared for intuitively and managed holistically during the 3rd stage. My daughter was perfect and latched immediately. She stayed bound to her first mother for about 4 hours before her father cut the cord with a hand-forged blade made by his own hands. My painful vaginal scar from tearing with my son's birth and being stitched too tight stretched but did not tear during her birth and was painful no longer. My milk flowed. She grew well. Postpartum depression could not touch me. It was beautiful, empowering, and healing. But even then, I felt a stirring of loneliness, an ache for community, ceremony, and sister bonds during the birth and the postpartum. to be held and cared for by another's gentle, healing touch and presence. I had wanted that alongside the freedom and total autonomy I had experienced with my unassisted birth. I knew that was the kind of birth witness, the kind of traditional midwife I wanted to be. My last and final pregnancy, I could have wanted. In some ways, I had. But due to the circumstances surrounding the conception, I could not. For one, I was ill. Terribly ill, with potentially Lyme disease or lupus. They did not know at the time, and they don't know now, 6 years after first falling sick. Either of those conditions, if the pregnancy survived them, would likely be passed on as congenital. That was a situation I wasn't willing to risk. And also, though I had been entertaining the idea of a final child, one last pregnancy and birth, now that my others were school-aged, I had started to think of it as not even being with my children's father, as he had no more desire for babies, but with another partner that I was seeing. It was not his baby, though, but the desire had been to have a baby with him, not so much the partner that I had actually conceived with, and that was not fair to anyone involved. This last pregnancy, my final birth, so too was released in the quiet warmth of my own home, midwifed by my now well-experienced self from this world to the spirit world. That too came with its own grief, in a way, its own heartache and sorrow that I had to bear alone. Each of my pregnancies, each of my births, all of my own reproductive experiences during my childbearing years have been an initiation. Each has brought me lessons and lived experience to carry me forward and ever deeper in my work as midwife to others. Each showed me where the system was broken, where autonomy could be reclaimed, where the sacred could be rewoven, when to turn to the herbs and the earth, and when to make relationship with pharmaceuticals and technology and how to dance with them together, how to listen to spirit and the intuition of our primal birthing bodies. Midwifing myself taught me how to midwife others, how to witness, how to trust, how to surrender, how to hold space for the sacred, and how to always, irrevocably, uphold autonomy. Thank you for joining me for today's podcast episode. If you feel called to autonomous, traditional, and holistic support on your journey, please visit www.bearwomanwisdom.com to learn more about my full-spectrum reproductive and naturopathic wellness offerings, upcoming classes and workshops, both online and in person, online resources such as digital ebooks, and my herbal apothecary.